On March 18th, 1990, the most audacious art heist of all time took place at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. Two men dressed as police officers were admitted into the building by security, claiming to be responding to a disturbance call.
In 81 minutes, 13 pieces of art were stolen. Among the portraits, stripped from their frames, were works by Vermeer, Degas, and Rembrandt. Estimated at $500 million, the heist has been categorized as the largest and most frustrating of all time. Theories of their whereabouts and those who perpetrated the crime are abundant.
In this podcast series, we will dig as deep as possible into the case, the theories, and the social and economic impact the greatest unsolved art heist of all time had on the community. This is Empty Frames. Welcome back to Empty Frames. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic today, Tim. It gets even better. Every time we do a new episode of Empty Frames, it gets even better. There was a hiatus, but all of a sudden we're getting this renewed interest, and it does fall in line with the anniversary of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist. But I feel like we got a little bit more momentum than we typically do around this time. We've had new theories, we've had expanded theories, and today's guest is literally the most articulate person we've ever had on any of our shows. Maybe that's a bit hyperbolic, but he's joining us again, and he's breaking down his theory and going into a little bit more detail on that. But Tim, sorry, I'm going into too much detail here without knowing how you're doing first. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks a lot for asking. And yes, very excited to once again introduce our guest, Eric Ulis. And Eric Ulis is one of the leading experts on the D.B. Cooper case, but also the Gardner Museum. And we've spoken to him about the Gardner Museum heist, I believe, 3 times in the past. And they were all season 3. You can scroll back just a little bit to find those episodes. And really, you might want to, because this is a little bit of an update. I mean, it stands on its own, but it's also a little bit of an update episode because we do follow up with some of the information he provided in those previous episodes. And most of it is centering around Brian McDevitt. He was a suspect in the Gardner heist from very early on, and Eric has had his eyes on him. He has spent some time with and got to know Brian McDevitt's girlfriend back in 1990, Stephanie Rabinowitz, and she joined us on the podcast as well to discuss her diaries, which are honestly pretty startling when you consider that her boyfriend at the time, Brian McDevitt, could have been one of the Gardner thieves.
I just love this episode. I love this conversation with Eric because he talks again about the diaries, and he discusses how the FBI just basically dropped the ball. You have the girlfriend of someone who was a direct suspect to this. He was like almost directly after, and he was a suspect, and they never thought to question her until like years later, and then they never thought to read the diaries that she had and she told them about until years later. And I just want to toot our horn here a little bit, Tim. Eric went on to say that he never would have gotten into the Gardner Museum heist, most likely, if he hadn't heard Empty Frames. And he was basically saying, you know, I heard the show, that's what sparked my interest, and look at that. Like he's holding on to material that someone had written down, which contradicts Brian McDevitt's alibi for the night, that time period of the heist. I find that so remarkable. So just pay us our $10 million.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're not the most polished Gardner heist podcast out there. That one belongs to the one produced by the Globe, but we're the people's podcast. We're the people's Gardner heist podcast, Lance.
We really are.
We're going to continue our journey, and today we continue our journey with Eric Ulis, speaking about the suspect known as Brian McDevitt.
And Eric Ulis is a contributor to our other podcast, Crawlspace, as well, with his investigation into, like you said, he's an expert in the D.B. Cooper disappearance. So check him out on Crawlspace and check out our other podcast, Missing. who knows? Maybe you're just discovering this podcast, Empty Frames, which is amazing. Love that. But we have 2 others, Missing and Crawlspace. So swing on over to wherever you listen to your podcasts and check those out as well. So we're going to break real quick for a commercial, and we'll be right back with, guess who, Tim?
Eric Ulis. Welcome back to Empty Frames, Eric Ulis. Eric, how are you today?
I'm doing well, guys. How are you doing?
We're doing great. We are actually just coming off of the heels of another conversation with you. We spoke and aired that episode just a couple of days ago, and it's always great to have you back on so soon after. This time, though, we are going to be catching up on any updates that you have with your investigation into the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist, which happened in March of 1990 in Boston. But before we get to that, I know people just heard your voice on Crawlspace, but can you fill everybody in for the listeners of Empty Frames?
Yeah, just a little bit about myself. I'm just somebody who, throughout my entire life, has loved riddles, loved mysteries, that kind of thing. I've always viewed these things as challenges, and it's always just sort of sparked something within me. I was the kid who, as a teenager, was trying to figure out how to do the Rubik's Cube and that type of thing. Played professional blackjack, as we talked about on the previous episode we just recorded, for a number of years. And part of that was just sort of relishing the challenge of beating the casino at their own game, that type of thing. So when it comes to these cold case mysteries, whether we're talking D.B. Cooper, Gardner Museum, whatever, there's an element of a challenge there that I relish, I really enjoy. And I'm primarily known, of course, for my work that's been done on the D.B. Cooper case. And as I've mentioned on previous episodes with you guys, I've headlined a History Channel show about the D.B. Cooper mystery, been on Expedition Unknown with Josh Gates, was part of a Netflix show called D.B. Cooper, Where Are You? And have been in the media several times, everything from Jake Tapper on CNN to, Shepard Smith to Fox News, talking about primarily the D.B. Cooper case. But I've also done a fair amount of work on the Gardner Museum heist. And I have to say, it's been a point of some sort of disappointment on my part that a lot of the stuff that I've discussed with respect to Gardner hasn't been taken more seriously by the authorities, because I think I'm very confident that essentially the story that I want to tell and what we've talked about before related to Gardner is pretty doggone close to the truth. So it's been somewhat disappointing that when I've talked about sort of gaining traction within the circle of the authorities, Anthony Amore at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, or maybe the FBI itself, formerly Jeff Kelly, or whoever is heading up the case now in Boston, I find it a little bit disturbing that they haven't seen fit to take this more seriously. But I understand it. I understand sort of the institutional think that goes on with the FBI there. I saw this with the D.B. Cooper case, as I've read the 40,000 pages of FBI files related to that case. And I've also seen the same sort of thing taking place when it comes to Gardner. But having said that, I push ahead, I proceed, just because, the FBI thinks that they've got it all sort of kind of figured out, except one minor piece, which is where the hell's the artwork? I'm going to continue to pursue the things I'm pursuing and see where that takes me as far as Gardner's concerned.
Yeah. And I'm just curious, how did you crack that institutional, protectiveness in the D.B. Cooper case?
Let me put it this way. The D.B. Cooper case is a 53-year-old cold case mystery. Gardner's 35, so there's a time difference there. But, we were very fortunate in the D.B. Cooper case in that there was a gentleman, an FBI agent, former FBI agent, now retired, a guy named Larry Carr, who realized that at that time, this was back in 2007, so 18 years ago, he's sitting there thinking, you know what? I mean, D.B. Cooper is still a mystery. It's the coldest of cold cases. We ain't getting anywhere just kind of like hoarding all the information and sitting on it, having it sit in boxes and shit. So let's, why not sort of open it up and let's put some of this information out to the public and let's just see where that takes us. And part of that eventually led to a Freedom of Information Act that was filed by a guy named Tom Colbert that opened up old FBI files. And we've literally at this point got some 40,000 pages of FBI files that have been released pertaining to the investigation of D.B. Cooper going back to the very beginning. So it's afforded me and others the opportunity to read, and of course they're redacted, but nonetheless read files and see how the investigation unfolded. It's also important to understand that, we're 53 years down the road. So there's things that I know now 53 years later that the authorities didn't know in 71 or 72, the early stages of the FBI investigation. So I've got some hindsight here, and I can identify problems and things of that nature that occurred. Because like I said before, I said this on the previous podcast, great mysteries like this are mysteries for a reason. Invariably, someone missed something somewhere, somehow, at some time. And again, I've always viewed my job as trying to put a finger on where the mistake was made, what was missed, what was overlooked. And so, there we go. That's how that works. Now, unfortunately, with respect to Gardner isn't a closed case, is still an active investigation. Virtually nothing, or shall I say very little of it, has been made public. They won't even go as far as confirming, the name of the two men who they think were actually involved, Lenny DiMuzio and George Reisfelder, even though it's kind of come out through some back channel ways, because there have been some court proceedings that have taken place in some tangential respects. So some of this information in a back doorway kind of made its way out publicly. But I don't think it's served the FBI well in terms of trying to solve this case. It certainly hasn't served Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum well, or anybody else for that matter that's interested in finding out the truth of what happened to that missing artwork. Because again, we got 13 pieces of art, 11 of which were paintings, sketches, that kind of thing. But we have two bronze pieces. So even if you're someone who believes that the artwork was destroyed, you still have those two bronze pieces that unlikely they're destroyed. They're out there somewhere. As we speak right now, they're out there somewhere, either sitting in underground somewhere or sitting at the bottom of some lake or something. I mean, those pieces are out there somewhere. Maybe they're sitting on someone's fireplace mantle and they just don't realize what the hell they have. So, I think the FBI would be well served to do what Larry Carr did in 2007, open the Gardner Museum files up, put as much information as possible out to the public that you can, and let's see what that does. Let's see what kind of leads, what kind of information that generates. Because at a minimum, we can safely say, or we know with certainty, that there would be an enormous amount of publicity that would come of it from the media and so forth. And just sort of breathing life into it in that respect, and all the spin-off documentaries and things that would likely come from all of that, that's good because it keeps it relevant. People hear of it, and you never know. You never know what can come of it all.
Yeah, I want to just commend you for keeping the conversation for these mysteries so active. And you can come back on the show anytime to talk about the Gardner Museum heist whenever you want. And I feel like that's important to even have you come on to talk about things that we've talked about numerous times, like the FBI, like your theory, like someone else's theory, and just try to piece everything together. Why is it though? Why is it that no matter how hard we seem to push, and I'm not saying Empty Frames is the #1 podcast in the world, but it has maybe a couple dozen listeners, I would hope. And those people talk to people, and they talk to people. How important is it to keep all of this going so that or is it even worth it? You know what I mean? Like, they had this major podcast and series and Netflix series, and it comes and people watch it and they get excited, and then all of a sudden we find ourselves like 2 years later, around the anniversary, talking about it again and saying, well, nothing happened. So what more has to be done? What can we do? I don't know, in your opinion.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'll challenge you a little bit on this here, because I think you're talking about the WMUR podcast that came out a couple of years ago, or several years ago, which was spectacularly done. Kelly Horan, whom I've talked with many times about this and so forth. That podcast and the information that was included in that, as well as the stuff that you gentlemen have done, played a big part of igniting my interest in Gardner. So if it weren't for you, and if it weren't for Kelly and her work with the other podcast, I may not be involved with Gardner to the degree I am. And I firmly believe that I basically know what happened. So actually, I could push back and say, I actually think it already accomplished what it already sort of is a mission accomplished type of thing, in that, to the degree that my theory is correct, I can basically tell you what happened and where we need to look moving forward if we want to find those bronze pieces in particular. But one thing I've noticed is that people become very proprietary. And, and again, this isn't a Smackdown Anthony Amore podcast or anything else, but I mean, I'm very familiar with all these people and all of this stuff, and I have my opinions, and this is Eric Ulis's opinion with respect to it. To me, I get the impression that this, at a certain point, becomes more personal than professional, basically, and there's sort of a proprietary nature of it. Anthony is done a lot of terrific work. He's written, fabulous books about art theft and that kind of thing. So he's infinitely more knowledgeable about artwork and theft and all that kind of stuff than me. But that doesn't mean I don't know what the hell I'm talking about, and it doesn't mean I'm not right. And to sort of just kind of wave it away flippantly, or it just doesn't comport with, what we want to believe is the case, I think is dangerous. That's how mistakes are made. Again, someone made a mistake somewhere, somehow, sometime. That's the anatomy of a mistake. That's how that kind of stuff happens. So I think, again, ultimately, it sort of comes down to the failings and flaws of human beings. And it's unfortunate, but it is what it is. That's just life. But having said that, I'm persistent. I'm resilient. I'm kind of I got a pretty thick skin, so, and I'm pretty confident in terms of the direction I've taken the investigation. And like I said, I feel like that my version is the closest version to the actual truth. And it may even be precisely what happened.
Cool. I want to just ask you one more thing about the FBI and investigations like this. What was the last one that we heard about in the news that they have solved? Like the last, that level of mystery, the D.B. Cooper, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist. What was the last one that had that sort of gravitas behind it that the FBI or some agency solved and said, we can put this to bed?
It's a really good question, isn't it? Yeah.
Have they solved anything?
I mean, obviously they've done yeoman's work in terms of, let's say, putting together the September 11th kind of thing and stuff like that. But yeah, you're absolutely right that when you think of Gardner, you think of D.B. Cooper, you think of John Benet Ramsey, you think of the Zodiac, several others, there's still no answers. There's still mysteries. I'm not saying they're easy, and I'm not saying that if the FBI had been completely forthcoming with details and those kind of things and open these things up to the public that we would have the answers. But let's just put it this way. I know that the path that they've taken thus far with those cases, in the case of Gardner, it ain't worked so far. That definitely hasn't worked. They still don't know what happened to the artwork. And I would argue that as much progress has been advanced in the Gardner case specifically from the private sector as has been done with the FBI, sort of that public sector, if you will, the public side of it. I mean, they initial investigations, we get the basic information, all that kind of stuff. But I mean, I think the ball has really been moved down the court more in recent years, private individuals such as myself and others.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. And a thanks to our sponsors. Now back to the program.
Yeah, the FBI, I think they believe that they tracked it through Philadelphia, and then I think they kind of feel like they might have lost the trace there. But this is definitely not your theory. So can you refresh our listeners' memories on what you think happened?
Yeah, I'll start off by saying, the FBI's theory, which basically is that, organized crime, elements of organized crime in Boston were, ripped off the artwork, and then, it ended up in Philadelphia and kind of then went somewhere else after that. And, the Carlos Merlino group in Dorchester, I think, was somehow involved in all these kind of moving pieces. Like, it sounds spectacular and wonderful and grand, and, everybody kind of loves the idea of sort of this mafia connection into it. But there are some very big problems, not the least of which you've had literally, people associated with organized crime that have gone to prison, have died in prison, that should have known or apparently knew about elements of this mystery and what happened with the artwork. But for some odd reason, they never revealed this information. They never used it as a get-out-of-jail-free card or anything like that. Putting aside the $10 million reward that still is out there today. If you or I or someone else can recover this artwork and hand it over today, we're instant millionaires, $10 million. So it just seems really implausible that you would have had these 13 pieces of art moving around this organized crime community, changing hands, and not a single person has said a single thing about it that's verifiable and credible. Either to get themselves out of jail or to get a portion of the $10 million or just recover the artwork because, well, we want to do something positive for society and recover the artwork. I mean, it's important to know this is 35 years. The statute of limitations has long since passed. No one's getting prosecuted at this point, even if you're the cat that actually ripped the stuff off. You're home free. You're good. In fact, you'll recover the ransom or the reward or a portion thereof, depending upon how much of it's there. So that's a very big problem. It just defies common sense. And then as you dig even further into why the FBI believes what they believe as far as this is concerned, it's hearsay. It's, somebody saying they saw something at Howard Johnson somewhere, or somebody said something, and it's just basically a crock of bullshit. I mean, going back to D.B. Cooper for a minute, I can't tell you how many people have confessed to being D.B. Cooper. Obviously, all of these people weren't D.B. Cooper. In fact, none of them were likely D.B. Cooper. So I don't know what it is about human beings that just sort of want to be involved and feel important, feel like, hey, I know something that nobody else knows, or whatever the case may happen to be. But that's what's gone on here. I mean, I'm having a hard time understanding why they actually put any kind of faith and credence in the words, in the opinions or words of criminals, bad guys like this, who are trying to posture and look like tough guys and hard asses and sort of, have a certain reputation within the community, that kind of thing, those circles and that type of thing. So there's just nothing, there's just no there. There's no meat there as far as that goes. So, as I started looking at the case, I pretty quickly thought, no, I just don't think the organized crime is involved. It doesn't make any sense to me. And as I looked into it further, I eventually came to kind of land on a suspect, a guy named Brian McDevitt. Now, Brian's no longer alive. He passed away in 2004, a long time ago. But I was particularly intrigued with Brian McDevitt for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that 10 years earlier in 1980, he tried to do the exact same type of heist in upstate New York, the Hyde Museum in Glens Falls, New York, and got caught. He failed and got caught, but the MO involved with the attempted heist in 80 was remarkably similar to what actually went down successfully in 1990 with Gardner. So that was of particular interest, and that got me really thinking this McDevitt guy may be involved in some way. That ultimately led me to coming upon his girlfriend at the time, a woman, Stephanie Rabinowitz, who was Brian's girlfriend at the time. And I got to know Stephanie very well, and we spent a lot of time talking about this case. But very importantly, Stephanie kept journals, kept a diary, kept a journal through basically her entire life. She's been keeping a journal. And so she's got a very detailed journals, day by day by day, things that were going on during the time that she was dating Brian, during the time of the heist, even the exact day of the heist, March 18, 1990. I was afforded the opportunity to read all of her stuff. Again, there's about 800 pages worth of writings there that pertain to this 3-year period of time when Stephanie started dating Brian and then when Stephanie stopped dating Brian, which went from basically July of 89 to July of 92, basically. Or she was no longer dating him by July of 92, but they were still friends. They were still in contact. And I've slowly been able to kind of peel away the onion layers. And ultimately, through a whole series of really digging into the details and the things that she had written down and everything else. And again, she knew nothing of Brian's history and knew nothing of, she was not involved with Gardner at all. She knew nothing of it during the time she was dating Brian. I was basically able to put together that I believe that Brian and a good friend of his named Steve Donahue were the two guys that were involved with this heist. And I also believe that there was a connection to Jamaica, because I know that Stephanie and Brian had actually visited Jamaica in December of 89, just a few months before the Gardner Museum heist took place. And then there were some other things that transpired after that. In January of 1990, Brian with Stephanie and actually Stephanie's father visiting a museum in Connecticut and that kind of thing, which I think was kind of Brian sort of starting to scope out some thoughts and ideas with respect to this. So there's a lot of sort of pieces that all started coming together. But very importantly, I think the glue that kind of spoke to a lot of this stuff and the truth was Stephanie's journals and seeing different things that were written on certain dates. And in retrospect, I can look at these things and say, oh, that's what's going on there. Ultimately, I figured that, I'm very comfortable in the belief that Brian was actually involved with this thing. And Steve Donahue was involved with this thing. And that there was some sort of tie-in with Jamaica. Initially, I think I told you that, and this is about a year ago when we spoke on Empty Frames, I talked about the fact that there is this drug ring basically in Jamaica, and they use high dollar art like this for collateral and this type of thing. And I also mentioned the fact that there was some artwork that had been ripped off at the Batona Museum in Italy in 1987 that was recovered in Jamaica actually just a couple of weeks after the Gardner took place, and that I felt like there was some sort of relationship between the Gardner heist and the Batona stuff. As time has gone on here, I've learned more about that, and my theory has been modified somewhat. But basically, I'll just say that a few months ago, there was a group of people, a couple people that were investigating the Batona heist in Italy. They're part of a think tank in Italy. They reached out to me, and one of the people who reached out to me was an inspector, a longtime inspector with the Italian, let's just call it the Italian FBI for lack of a better term. And he dealt in artwork for 30 years. So we started communicating about this because they had come across my work on Gardner and my assertions that this is somehow all related here, that, Jamaica and everything has played a part. And they found this particularly intriguing because as they were looking into and researching the Batona artwork, and this gentleman actually recovered the Batona artwork in 1990, I got a much better understanding of what was taking place there. And basically, there was a drug dealer, a major drug dealer in Italy, that was taking in a large shipment from Colombia, and they were using this artwork as collateral. And ultimately, the artwork and the drugs and everything were kind of centered on Jamaica there. Now, the people in Jamaica that were involved were not actually drug dealers. They were essentially escrow agents, for lack of a better term. They were guarantors of the drug shipment and everything else. So they would hold the artwork. In the case of the Batona Museum, there's $8.2 million worth of artwork ripped off there that ended up in Jamaica, and that was used to guarantee or serve as collateral or what have you for the large drug shipment that was to work its way to Europe by way of Spain, and then ultimately Italy, and be sold throughout Europe. And this is true. This is actually what happened, and this is the way that works. Well, eventually, of course, through the efforts of this gentleman and others, obviously, in the Italian law enforcement agencies, they ultimately figured out what happened, and they realized that the artwork was in Jamaica. They realized that these escrow agents in Jamaica had the artwork. Importantly, why it was so difficult for this thing to sort of unravel and get solved was because the person who actually held the artwork, the person who actually was found with the artwork and convicted of possessing what he knew were stolen goods, was a guy named John Franklin. He was a senator, a Jamaican senator. And this Jamaican senator was very close with the prime minister of Jamaica, a guy named Edward Sega, I guess is that's how I pronounce the name. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it properly. But the prime minister's sister also, they're claiming, was involved. She was not the ambassador to Italy. She was the consul. She was the Italian consul there in Jamaica. But so you have some very high-powered people that were kind of involved with this illicit trade there. And basically, eventually in 1990, there was a shift of political leadership there in Jamaica, and that kind of opened things up, because before that point, before that shift in political leadership, there were the efforts of the Italian authorities to get to the bottom of it were obviously rebuffed. They just couldn't get anywhere. But with the change in leadership, then everything came out. Of course, the Senator John Franklin, Jamaica, ended up getting busted, getting convicted and everything else. And there you go. So what's interesting, though, is the timing of all of this stuff. This stuff happened before the Gardner Museum heist took place. A few months before, that's when the Italian authorities started sniffing around Jamaica. So Jamaican authorities knew that the Italians kind of knew what was going on, even though they couldn't really do anything about it at that point. And this was going back to 1989. And then basically with the change in political leadership in the beginning of 1990, then the shit kind of hit the fan and everything collapsed. Ultimately, the artwork in the Batona artwork and the arrest of this John Lynch took place 39 days after the Gardner Museum heist. So I believe quite firmly that Brian McDevitt and Steve Donahue, and Steve lived in Jamaica. So I think he was the point person in Jamaica there for Brian and for Brian as well. I believe that they had designs to basically kind of replicate what this drug guy in Italy had done, which was, steal a bunch of art, send it to the escrow agent in Jamaica, get a large shipment of drugs, and then, go about doing their business. So I believe that initially I was thinking Brian and Steve probably just were trying to collect the art and they were going to sell it to this escrow agent or what have you. But I've changed my mind on that after talking with the people from Italy, the authorities in Italy that I've talked with about this. I now believe that what Steve and Brian were trying to do was literally get involved in the drug business themselves. I think that they were actually involved in a small level way, selling drugs, distribution, that kind of thing in Boston early on, meaning throughout the latter part of the 1980s, because trying to figure out where Brian got his money has been damn near impossible. He apparently had no form of employment, but nonetheless, he could afford to take Stephanie to Jamaica. They would go out to fine dinners all the time, and he had a nice apartment on Beacon Hill right across from the Capitol. I've been to the place. This is the money was coming from somewhere. He's traveling back to L.A. pretty regularly. So something was up. He was coming up with his money somehow, and I believe that he was involved with trafficking in drugs and selling drugs at some small-time level. So I now believe that what they were trying to do was basically kind of enter the big league. At some point while they were in Jamaica, or maybe Steve Donahue got wind of it living in Jamaica, at some point, I think that they kind of, the thought crossed their mind that, hey, let's rip off some artwork. Let's use it as collateral. We've got the contacts. We got the people in Jamaica that we can serve as escrow agents, and we can basically start distributing on a larger scale here in the United States. And I believe that they intended on doing this in LA, in California, because actually about 6 weeks after the Gardner heist took place, around June 1st of 1980, Brian actually moved to LA, and he had been kind of planning a move in advance as well. So that's what I believe was going on, is that they were dreaming up basically becoming big-time drug dealers in LA, and essentially doing the same sort of thing that this drug mob guy in Italy had done. But unfortunately for Brian and for Steve, the shit hit the fan, obviously, in Jamaica, and these escrow agents that were kind of like the middlemen that were going to put this entire thing together, basically that whole thing fell through immediately after, just days after the Gardner Museum heist. So that created a very, very big problem for Brian and Steve, in that they no longer had a customer, for lack of a better term. They were just stuck with the artwork there. And I think that's the beginnings, basically, of probably a not too savory ending for the artwork. So I'll kind of leave it at that there. I don't know if you want to ask questions, but I just wanted to kind of lay out kind of where my mind is and what my thoughts are now with respect to this. I figure we could drill down into specifics if you want to.
Yeah. And I just, before we get to specifics, I just have an opinion question. So they have the artwork. They realize that the escrow connection falls through, and that's not going to be a possibility anymore. Why wouldn't they explore a better way to keep the artwork safe in the meantime? Also, do you think that they knew what the statute of limitations was on this? Because if they have all of this artwork and they're sitting on it and they hear that there's going to be a reward for this, would it have crossed their mind to be like, let's make sure that this is totally safe, and we'll wait for the statute of limitations to run out, and then we'll make our move and we'll give it back to the museum?
I think that's a good question, but let's put yourself in Brian's shoes for a minute.
Can I be in Jamaica when I do this?
Yes.
Okay.
So, put yourself in his shoes in the sense that 10 years earlier, he got busted and went to jail, and jail wasn't very fun. And you get busted again doing something of this magnitude. You're not talking jail now. Now you're talking prison, and you're going to probably spend 40 years in prison. So I think the whole prospect, the whole idea of going to prison 40 years scared the shit out of him, as it would probably scare the shit out of anybody. So when the heist took place, he immediately was in the crosshairs of the FBI. And he knew very shortly after that the FBI was interested in him as a suspect. They pulled him in. They interviewed him. They talked to him. So immediately, well before the statute of limitations was anywhere close to expiring, the FBI was sniffing around Brian McDevitt. And obviously he was well aware of that. And then you couple that with the fact that 39 days later, the whole thing falls apart in Jamaica. Who knows what those people in Jamaica knew of Brian and Steve Donahue? If there had been some kind of deals that they had talked about, before the whole thing blew apart or blew up in Jamaica, I can imagine Brian would probably be somewhat concerned that they're going to get ratted out. So these guys get, the John Franklin guy, for example, gets a lesser sentence or something of that nature. You can't be sure that someone on that end isn't going to rat you out. I think that ultimately backed Brian in a corner where he realized that this isn't going to be as simple as just kind of like stashing this artwork for the next 5-7 years, whatever the case may happen to be. There's a very good chance he gets busted well before that period of time. And it's also important, too, to consider that they ripped off what was then valued at $200 million worth of art. So it was immediately radioactive. It was immediately on the national and international news. I mean, it was all over the place. So I think Brian got very concerned and started to panic very quickly. And I just think the heat got too great for him. And he's like, listen, I'm just going to leave, this whole thing fell through. And we're sitting here holding this shit, and I'm not going to prison. And I think there was a very easy solution, and I think ultimately the solution for him was to destroy the artwork. I believe that he burned it. I believe that he burned it in the fireplace of his Hollywood Hills home. And I think that the reason he did that was because his primary concern was staying out of prison. And actually, it may have been mission accomplished in that respect. If Brian hadn't burned the artwork, who knows? Maybe he would have actually gotten caught and gone to prison. But obviously, that didn't happen. Now, what makes this doubly interesting is that Brian, from the very beginning, at least with respect to his relationship to Stephanie, he passed himself off as a script writer, working for the Wonder Years, writing articles for the Atlantic, the New Yorker, that kind of thing, as a writer, an accomplished person in Hollywood, that kind of thing. And Stephanie believed him, didn't think anything of it. He certainly lived the lifestyle that seemed to suggest that type of career, that type of thing. And one of the things that Brian did right after moving to LA, which again was just a couple of months after the Gardner Museum heist, he loaded up a van, which I've always thought was weird. He had a van that he drove back there. So I think he hauled the artwork back there with his van, over to LA with the van. But one of the things he did is he started partnering with a guy named Ben Pollock. And Ben Pollock was very much his junior. Ben Pollock was a younger guy, just sort of breaking into the whole, Hollywood kind of scene or what have you at that time. But nonetheless, they started collaborating on some scripts. They were trying to get some scripts, movie scripts, that type of thing, greenlit by some production houses there in LA. And I've talked with Ben at length about this stuff, and Ben recalled a story to me, told me that during their early days they were trying to come up with some ideas that they could get greenlit, and they weren't having any success. They were just kind of not going anywhere. And that Ben said that one day Brian came in with this idea, this movie script idea that Ben said he could tell Brian was very passionate about. It was sort of the first idea that he had heard from Brian that actually sounded kind of cool. And basically the story, as it was presented by Brian, relates to a couple of thieves, bumbling thieves, who decided to rip off some artwork, several pieces of artwork, including a couple metal pieces from a museum, and that they basically succeed. And they were almost shocked that they succeeded in pulling this thing off. Like, holy cow, we actually did it. And it's kind of like the dog who caught the car kind of a thing. They couldn't believe they actually did it, sort of thing. And they had arranged, and again, as the movie script goes, they arranged to sell the artwork to somebody in Germany. They travel out to Germany to effect the sale. but the sale falls through, and they ultimately kind of panic because they've got all this hot artwork, and they decide to burn it in a cave. They decide to burn it in a cave in Germany, and the metal pieces, the couple metal pieces, they decide to bury, because you obviously couldn't burn the metal. They decide to bury those metal pieces. That was the story that Brian came up with for the idea behind his script. And when you consider that, and you consider just sort of the totality of what has happened, as I've described here, which is actually verifiable in many ways, I think that actually speaks to the truth of what happened. I don't think Brian obviously hauled the artwork to Germany and burned it in a cave, but I think that is essentially what happened, in that Brian and Steve Donahue ripped off $200 million worth of the art. I think they were kind of shocked that they were successful at it, with how easy it was and just the sheer magnitude of the theft. Their customer, if you will, again, I think ultimately fell through, of course, in Jamaica. They again, the stuff by this point I think was located in LA. And the cave, and the burning in the cave thing, I think speaks to the fact that it was actually burned in Brian's fireplace. Now, we've talked about this before. Why that's interesting is because the Hollywood Hills home that Brian lived in, I've been in that house a couple of times. I know the homeowners there. The main feature of the house is this huge rock fireplace. I literally can climb into the fireplace, and I'm a big guy. I'm 6'3". I can fit into that fireplace there. And it just sort of conjures up this, the cave thing is basically the fireplace, and that's where the stuff was burned. So I think that ultimately that's what happened. I think that Brian burned the artwork in that fireplace there. Those two bronze pieces, the finial and the Chinese coup, obviously they weren't burned. They were buried, or whatever the case may happen to be. But I think that ultimately is what happened there. And I think that this crafted or made up movie script thing that Brian came up with this one day with talking with Ben Pollack, and this would have been back in 1992, so this would have been 2 years after the heist took place. I think that's what happened. And at this point, the artwork would have been long burned, because I believe, just based upon what Stephanie has written about in her journals and everything, I believe that it was burned within months of being taken, because everything fell through pretty quickly. And one intriguing thing that I want to mention with respect to this is that Steve Donahue, the guy that I believe was involved with this with Brian, who lived in Jamaica, and Stephanie and Brian met up with Steve in Jamaica in December of '89. I can actually put him in Boston 13 days before the heist. Stephanie actually has it written in her journal, just, oh yeah, Steve's in town from Jamaica, This was 13 days before the heist. So there's a lot of pieces and a lot of things like that I obviously too many to speak to here during our conversation. But I think it tells a story, and I think it speaks to the truth of what happened there. And that's just the sad reality of it all, in my opinion.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. And a thanks to our sponsors. Now back to the program.
You mentioned Steve Donahue, so he would have been the other thief.
That's correct. And because I believe that if you look at Brian and Steve, you look at pictures of them, I think that obviously the very famous sketches of the Gardner, they almost look comical. They're so ridiculous, but there's enough that you can kind of basically pick out from the sketches, the police sketches of the two thieves with the fake mustache and all that, where you can see that there's a resemblance. Brian's got the rounder face, Steve is a little thinner, that kind of thing. One guy has shorter hair, one guy has a little longer hair. So you get some of that depicted there. So yes, I believe it was Brian and Steve. I think it was those two guys on the night of the heist. I do believe that it was an inside job, meaning I think Rick Abbott was involved. I don't think he was like some sort of mastermind guy. I just think he kind of got doped into it in a way, and I'm not exactly sure how, but I'm quite convinced that Rick Abbott was involved in that in some way as well. But yeah, I do believe that that those two guys, that Brian and Steve, were the two thieves that actually pulled off the heist.
What happened to Steve after the heist? Is he still around? Did you ever get a chance to talk to him?
Got murdered in Jamaica. Yeah, he got murdered in Jamaica. I've tried to figure out exactly when and how. I know it was relatively, it was somewhere in the early to mid 90s, because I know Steve had actually traveled to LA to meet Brian in LA. So I know he was alive as of 1992, but something happened there. I'm not exactly sure the story. I've tried to get to the bottom of it. I've had a really hard time finding anything about that. But it may have something to do with the fact that it was in 1992. I think it was in June of 1992 when the shit kind of hit the fan for Brian. At this point, Brian's living in LA. Stephanie Rabinowitz, his former girlfriend, is also living in LA. They're not dating, but they still, socially hang out from time to time. But it's at that point where, in 1992, where Brian actually was the LA Times wrote quite a lengthy piece about the prospective involvement of Brian McDevitt in the Gardner Museum heist. And actually, I think what it may have been is it may have been the New York Times, and then LA Times picked up on it, and then the Boston Globe picked up on it. So basically, there was an enormous amount of publicity that was around Brian McDevitt specifically as a person of interest related to the case. And this all happened in 92. And this is also about the time where Brian was called in front of a federal grand jury in Boston, and asked about it. Now, Brian, he mentioned to somebody else, another one of his colleagues, that he was actually afraid that he was going to get indicted by this federal grand jury. And that ultimately precipitated in him fleeing and him leaving the United States. He left the United States in 1993 to South America, never to come back. He passed away in 2004, but he never came back. So again, there's a lot of things going on there that you have to ask yourself: is this how an innocent person acts? Not the least of which, I think, and this is a critical piece as well, that I want to say, is that when Stephanie last spoke with Brian, this was the last time she talked with him, which I believe was July 25th, 1992. It was actually at a party for the closing of the Ren and Stimpy show, and because Stephanie was involved with the production of that. And Brian actually asked her to come to South America with him. He said he was going to be going to South America. And he said he actually confessed to Stephanie and said that he actually confessed to her and said that he did rip off the Gardner Museum artwork. So he actually did confess to Stephanie ultimately in 1992 to it. So, I mean, like we talked about earlier here, there's a lot of people who confess to shit who didn't do it. They just kind of want to be associated with it. But Brian was already pretty well associated with it. You know what I'm saying? By this point, the newspaper, and he ended up doing they actually ended up featuring him on 60 Minutes, the news program related to this. So he was already kind of associated with it. And while he denied involvement publicly, privately, he told Stephanie he actually was involved with this thing and did it. So, again, these are the kind of things that are very intriguing. I should also note that Brian asked Stephanie on two separate occasions to lie to the FBI and basically say that for Stephanie to be his alibi for the night of the heist. So Brian wanted Stephanie to lie about that. And Stephanie, of course, refused to lie about it. But again, why would somebody, why do you need to lie about an alibi if you're not involved or what have you? And we know, again, fortunately for us, Stephanie actually has writings, in her journal in and around, that the date of the heist. So we know that on the date of the heist, March 17th, March 18th, going into March 18th, Brian was apparently in New York City for some Writers Guild Award. And Stephanie writes about this. Brian's going to New York City, Writers Guild Award, blah, 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 blah. This is the bullshit story Brian was telling. Well, that eventually they realized, well, that's bullshit. The Writers Guild Award was not in March. It was actually a month later. And Brian eventually admitted that he was in Boston that night. He didn't go to New York after all. So he had lied to Stephanie. So he had no alibi. He had no alibi for the night of the heist. But nonetheless, it didn't stand in the way of him trying to get Stephanie to lie to the FBI, perjure herself, and serve up herself up as an alibi. But of course, Stephanie said no. She's not going to do it.
So I'm curious when the FBI came to take those journals and to fully go through and dissect them.
See, that's a very good question. The answer is never, which is shocking to me. What's more amazing to me is that they didn't realize, the FBI didn't even realize that Stephanie had journals until 14 years after the heist took place. It wasn't until 2004. Of note as well, Stephanie was interviewed twice by the FBI. The first time she was interviewed by the FBI was in 1992. So it was 28 months after the heist took place before the FBI even interviewed Stephanie for the first time, which is particularly egregious and shocking when you consider Brian, who was interviewed very shortly after the heist took place, actually used Stephanie, presented Stephanie as an alibi to the FBI. But they never bothered to check it out. They didn't check it out until, I guess, 28 months later. And I'm not even sure what transpired at that point in 1992. But it wasn't until 2004, 14 years later, when the FBI interviewed her a second time, in Seattle at that point, where they realized that, she's got these journals, this diary that has all of these dates and all of this information in there, not the least of which is information that clearly spells out that Brian was not with Stephanie on the night of the heist, and a whole bunch of other stuff as well. So what ended up happening is Stephanie, you would have thought at that point that the FBI would have said, I tell you what, let's go ahead and take your journals, 800 pages worth of journals covering that 3-year period of time that they knew each other. And we want to take them, we want to read them, we want to photograph, whatever, and then we'll get them back to you. They didn't do that. What they did is they relied upon Stephanie to pull out some comments and dates and things of that nature, photocopy them, and fax that information to Jeff Kelly at the FBI. I've seen the fax. The fax was May 4th, 2004. I've actually seen the fax that was faxed over there. And I'm like, that's just being fucking lazy is what that shit is. Now, Stephanie did a good job of, faxing over, a dozen or so different interesting things she had written about in the journals and so forth, comments and that type of thing. So she did a good job as far as that goes. But there was a lot of stuff she missed. And that makes perfect sense because you got 800 pages of this shit. And she's trying to, go, was she going to read something she wrote, 14 years earlier and try, what I'm saying? She didn't bother reading it cover to cover. I did. I read it cover to cover, that 800 pages. So there were a number of other things that I noticed in there that I thought, I'm like, wow, that's actually of particular interest here that the FBI is completely unaware of. But very importantly, you have to read the full 800 pages to get a feel for what was actually taking place during that entire period of time. You have to kind of understand sort of the narrative and how the whole thing unfolds over time. And you can't get that from reading little excerpts here and there, a dozen excerpts from 800 pages. That's not the same as reading the book,
right.
And that's the problem. So again, were mistakes made and who made them and all that kind of stuff? That's one of those mistakes right there. They just never bothered to be a little more thorough about this, or a lot more thorough. And you would have thought at a minimum they would have taken possession of her journals. She would have handed them over, I'm sure, gladly for a couple of months or whatever, for them to do what they need to do and then hand them back. This never happened.
How long did it take you to read the journal?
The 800 pages, I think I pretty much got through all that stuff within a week or so. I've referenced them and gone back to them many, many times. So, I mean, while the sort of initial reading was probably a week or two, I've gone back and referenced them many, many times after that. So again, if the FBI had taken possession, had photocopied all 800 pages, taken notes, and then of course as things pop up, they can go back and look at pages and stuff like that. I mean, that would have been in my diseased mind the way to sort of properly investigate this thing. But it just, for whatever reason, they just didn't take it as seriously as they should have taken it, and that's why 35 years out, they still don't know what the going on. They don't know where the artwork is. They have no explanation for it. Nobody can explain why nobody ratted anybody out to get out of jail free. Nobody can explain why the hell nobody's trying to avail themselves of the $10 million or portion thereof the $10 million. Nobody can explain any of this shit, especially considering the statute of limitations has long since passed. And they're just barking up the wrong tree is what it comes down to.
Wow. Well, this is really fascinating stuff, Eric. I'm wondering about that property that Brian McDevitt lived at in Los Angeles. Was there like a backyard or anything? Was there any talk? Because I'm wondering where the finial and the goo ended up. Any chance he buried that in his yard or anything like that?
I've thought about that a lot. It's the Hollywood Hills, for those who have been there or haven't been there, is kind of like there's like a bunch of like sort of canyons, like small canyons. So houses are kind of like on the hillsides and stuff like that. And that's what we've got going on here. This particular house is kind of on a hillside. So the backyard there's a small backyard, but it's pretty steep, and then it descends down into a ravine, basically. So I have looked at that, and I've thought perhaps something was buried there. Perhaps something was buried in the basement. I know that there's like a small patio that has like a slab of concrete on it that I've discussed with the homeowner that maybe was buried under there at some point, because it's hard to date exactly when some of these, like the slab of concrete, for example, was placed there, what have you. So it is entirely possible that it's buried somewhere on that property. Those items are buried on that property. It's also possible that they didn't want to be anywhere near them, and they just like drove out to the Pacific Ocean and chucked them in the ocean. But, I mean, I don't know. I mean, would they have been afraid of getting pulled over by the cops on the way to the ocean with the two pieces in their car? I don't know. Or Brian, would he have been afraid of that? I don't know. So it's hard to say whether he would have tried to drag him somewhere else and dispose of them, or if he would have tried to just be safe and just under cover of darkness in his own property, in his own house that he was living in, just climb out back and bury the stuff. But I think the first place I would look would be that house. As you gentlemen know, and I spoke to this last time, I actually have accessed the fireplace there. There's debris that I've pulled from the fireplace. Specifically, there's a chamber that's an old ash chamber that is on the back floor of the fireplace. Back in the old days, meaning when Brian was there, you could burn wood or whatever in the fireplace. Then you could open this chamber flap on the floor in the back of the fireplace and push all the ash down into this chamber. Then you could walk around the outside of the house and access this chamber from outside by the fireplace, by the chimney, and you could dispose of all the ash that way. Well, that chamber was closed off by the addition of a natural gas line years and years ago. I naturally started thinking, well, there may be some debris in that chamber that hasn't been accessed for 30-something years that may be commensurate with burning of the artwork. And there is actually quite a bit of debris in there and some odd stuff in there, as we've talked about before. I did an initial test of this stuff under a scanning electron microscope, but it was really very inconclusive. It was inconclusive as far as that goes. That said, I would definitely be interested, and I have it in my mind to take a much more comprehensive look and a much more comprehensive scientific analysis of the debris that came out of that fireplace there. On the surface, you may think, well, what the hell are you going to find? You burn a 400-year-old painting, what's going to be there? Well, the thing is that the paint, the oil paints that they used back then, the paints that they used back then, contained metals. I mean, you had lead, you had zinc in them, you had cinnabar, which has lead in it. So there's So there may be some traces of lead, zinc, perhaps mercury there. And if you find traces of that in a fireplace, naturally you would kind of wonder, well, how did these things end up in a fireplace? I mean, what were you burning that contained that? So that would be the kind of thing that ultimately would be tried to identify and look for. So I do think that the paintings were burned there in the fireplace, and it is reasonable to assume that at the same time that the paintings would have been destroyed, that the two bronze pieces would also have been discarded, and they probably would have been buried. If I had to hazard a guess, I would say somewhere on that property. Yeah, on the back property. Steep slope, maybe covered up somehow with a concrete slab. I don't know. But that's kind of exactly where I would look if I was going to look today,
Wow.
So
I hate thinking that the paintings have been destroyed. And even though we're talking about criminals here, I feel like McDevitt wasn't like a totally bad person, right? Like he wasn't the greatest person, but he wasn't like a psycho. I don't think he was a psychopath. But so in my head, I think only someone who with no empathy can take those paintings and burn them. So, that's like my hurdle, as I can't come to terms with pouring some sort of accelerant on a freaking Rembrandt on these paintings and being like, I'm lighting it up. Like, that is insane to me.
Well, I'm going to challenge you on this here, because if Brian McDevitt was the guy who did it, this was the same guy who recklessly pulled the shit off the wall and took a razor blade and razor bladed the stuff out of there.
Yeah, so
I mean, they were pretty reckless. Whoever the thieves were, and I believe again it was McDevitt and Donahue. They obviously weren't overly concerned about keeping the artwork in pristine condition. So that's the one thing. And the other thing is that when you're talking about the alternative, which is to go to jail for 40 years, I think, Brian actually struck me as a very selfish individual. He didn't think twice about shoplifting or, stealing or what have you, because he wanted it or needed it. And there are several examples of that. And he even got, caught, shoplifting and that type of thing in previous years. Not to mention the fact that he tried to rip off the artwork at the Hyde Museum. And in fact, months before the Hyde Museum, he had actually was working for the Ted Kennedy for Senate campaign in some manner there, and ripped off, if my memory serves me correct, somewhere between $50,000 and $100,000 in cash from like a safety deposit box or something related to that campaign back in the, I guess would have been probably 1979. So Brian McDevitt had a well-established resume, if you will, of basically taking other people's shit. And he could on occasion as well threaten people. Ben Pollack, the producer that I talked about that he came up with this movie script with, Ben Pollack eventually figured out that Brian McDevitt was a con man and called him out on it. And Brian started harassing the shit out of the guy and actually threatening the guy. So he was pulling out his best Whitey Bulger, kind of imitation there at times with Pollack. And also in 1980, he tried to, again, rob the Hyde Museum in 1980 with somebody that he also had sort of strong-armed into helping him with that. And the individual that he strong-armed into helping him with that, he also threatened him. And this is in the police records. This is well documented at the time. So there was a side of Brian that was really, really kind of scary and shady. So I don't think Brian would have thought twice about covering his ass, irrespective of the cultural significance of the artwork or anything. I think that was the last thing on his mind. That his immediate concern was covering his ass and making sure he doesn't end up in prison for the next 40 years.
Yeah, so maybe he was a psycho. I have one more thing. Which do you think is going to get solved first of the following? The Gardner heist, D.B. Cooper, Jimmy Hoffa, or me solving a Rubik's Cube?
Well, you solving the Rubik's Cube, we're just going to put that on number 4.
Definitely. Like,
because I'm betting you haven't even tried. So that's
no,
the first
I
thing.
have tried. I've watched videos. I can't get past a certain part, and my sister got me a Rubik's Cube for Christmas as sort of like a small gift like 4 years ago. And I'm not kidding. Like, I went from Christmas until probably February trying to solve it, and I was like, this is becoming an obsession, so I needed to like hide it. It's in a closet. I can't even look at it, but maybe I'll pick it up again one day, but I couldn't do it.
Well, there is a book, because I remember when it first came out, I didn't crack the Rubik's Cube. I mean, I picked up a book on it and read about the different patterns and stuff. And yeah, so I taught myself how to do it, and I could actually do it. I think the fastest time I did it was like 12 seconds or something like that.
Oh, come on.
Yeah, you can do it very quickly. And again, it's just a matter of recognizing patterns and everything there. So there are books that can help you with that. It's interesting because when we talk about like Jimmy Hoffa, I mean, Jimmy Hoffa, I think it's kind of like the Gardner Museum artwork. I just think it's destroyed. I think Jimmy Hoffa was destroyed in some way, probably burned or chopped up or whatever the deal is. So, I mean, there's really nothing to discover. And, even in the case of Gardner, like let's say we verify that there's a small piece of a canvas painting in the fireplace. Well, most of us are going to say, well, that pretty much is about as close to a smoking gun as you're going to get, but it's still not like DNA level, 1,000,000,000,000 kind of proof. So, I think there'll always be a measure of uncertainty. And I firmly believe the artwork is destroyed. Therefore, there's really nothing more to discover other than maybe the bronze pieces. So I think the case that probably has the best chance of actually getting solved, like let's put a finger on the guy, I'm going to say is D.B. Cooper, just because, there's real stuff to work with there. And he was a real person. And, we can probably figure out through science some of the scientific evidence in that case, ultimately who the guy is, as I've talked about when we interviewed recently about this. So, yeah, I said D.B. Cooper is the most likely case to get solved. I think the number 2 would probably be Gardner, because you still have the 2 bronze pieces presumably out there, and that there may be enough information with it. Like if you find the 2 bronze pieces in the backyard of the Hollywood Hills home that Brian McDevitt lived in, well, that pretty much cinches the case too. Like that it ended up there, and maybe you could reasonably deduce that the stuff was burned in the fireplace. Hoffa, I don't know that we'll ever know anything more about that than we already know. Apparently nobody's talking. A lot of people are dead now, and but all very interesting, intriguing cases to be sure. Yeah.
Well, I think Lance can solve the Rubik's Cube before Jimmy Hoffa's found.
Thank you.
I hope so, man.
I'll just take the stickers off and rearrange them.
There you go. Well, that'll work.
I just outsmarted it.
Yeah.
Eric, you've done it again. You've come on here and kind of blown our minds on these with these ideas and these theories. So thank you so much for sharing. I think it's very plausible what you laid out here. And I do wonder if the whoever lives in that house now would break out a metal detector and just give it a once over. Maybe rent one. You don't even have to buy one. Maybe.
Yeah, it could be a couple of million in there for you.
I mean, hey.
Yeah. I've talked with these people. They're terrific people. They're a younger couple. Well, everybody's younger than me at this point. So not everybody, but they're super nice people. And I would love, one of the things I've tried to work on behind the scenes is actually partnering with a production company or a network or somebody to actually do something, a limited series doc on this or something. And I'm hopeful that something eventually comes up in that realm, because, there are some really cool things that we could actually explore like that, lean into some of the technology that we have today, whether it's ground penetrating radar, metal detector, LiDAR, something of that nature. There's a lot to work with here nowadays. So you would think that if there was anything there on that property, that we'd be able to uncover it and figure it out. And the thing is that it may actually be there, and we may actually solve this thing. So it has a very real potential of actually being a solved case. I guess I just need the right situation, network or what have you to basically reach out and say, let's make it happen. So we'll see.